Welcome to Write Good, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm R.S. Benedict. In previous episodes, I have said over and over again that one of the best ways to improve your writing is to read a lot. And I must stress that you have to read books and stories. Movies and video games can be well-crafted works of storytelling, but a good movie won't help you write as well as a good book, because written fiction is a different medium with different strengths. Mainly, movies and video games are audiovisual media, while fiction has the unique ability to explore the internal and the invisible. With me today to talk about this is Karlo Yeager Rodríguez, sci-fi fantasy author and co-host of Podside Picnic. Karlo, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me back. All right.
For the first time ever to talk about this topic.
Yes, there is not a lost reel at all. Oh, fuck.
But anyway, let's get into it. There's something I've noticed a lot when I'm writing that kind of leaves me cold. Maybe this is unpublished writing that's put up for critique, or maybe this is published writing that's just not blowing me away. But something I find a lot of the writing that leaves me cold, the writing that doesn't interest me, that doesn't do it for me, is that what happens is that these stories are being written like movies. Particularly, they're being written like a blockbuster movie. And I see that over and over again in stories that just, for me, aren't up to snuff. It feels like it's written like a movie, especially a big budget kind of popcorn movie.
Right.
And that style of writing can work pretty good in a movie because you've got the visual effects to back it up, but on the page, all you have are words, and it's not coming through in the words.
Right. I feel like when I was first starting out and just really sort of dedicating myself a bit more to writing, like about 10 years ago or whatever, I tended, and this is just to explain, these are two different things, but they can get smashed together because of the tendency for writing advice to be like, oh, write cinematically. So then you smash that together with show, don't tell, and then you have like these very sterile with just scenes that are just audiovisual. They don't really integrate like the way you would think in a given situation. If it were happening to you and in a book, you would get a bit of interiority. And here I was, just coming out the gate, not even really started, hadn't really even started submitting anything yet. And here I'm thinking to myself, I'm copying Hemingway. See, this is what Hemingway does.
Oh, no.
But, Hemingway had, at least a couple of decades of journalism under his belt to be able to get away with some of the ways that he wrote.
He kind of encodes the interiority into these descriptions anyway, like it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just not explicitly inside. He thought like it's there in the prose and in the descriptions of the environment.
Right. And
he was good at writing.
I feel like there is a small caveat to read a lot, because you can read you see what. To go to Hemingway again, just briefly, like you said, he does have it there, but to an untrained or a self-taught eye, as many writers tend to be, you may not immediately be able to sort of peel away the layers, and all you see is a perfect series of sentences that make a story. And the caveat to read a lot is you can also read bad books to see how it's
right.
Like, honestly, you actually learn a lot because it's sort of, I use the metaphor of like, if you've ever stitched together or had a sewn piece of clothing,
Right.
you can sometimes tell that it's a first or a second attempt because you can see all the stitching. Whereas a more polished seamstress or tailor or whomever would then hide the stitching as needs be.
Right.
You read something from a very good established author, Henry James or a Jane Austen, or you are going to get that piece of clothing or that wove in the story where you don't actually see the stitching unless they want you to see it.
Right. But sort of the reason I stress reading is just because I feel like a heck of a whole lot of aspiring writers, aspiring genre writers especially, really don't read all that much. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who say, I want to be a writer, and you ask, well, who's your favorite writer? And they're like, oh, I don't really like to read very much. It's like, what? No, get out, go home, or maybe study screenwriting. You like movies, study screenwriting, right that way, because there's a particular type of writing that works very well for the screen and doesn't work in a book very well, mainly because film is an audio-visual medium. Its strengths is visuals and audio. Books are not. So if a good movie plays to its strengths, or maybe even over-relies on this big visual spectacle, a book can't rely on visual spectacle because there's no visuals. Hi, Kat.
Well, I mean...
So say if all you're watching is like, I don't know, MCU movies, the climax always relies on this big CGI orb or something, or CGI portals and CGI people smashing into each other with explosions superimposed on the background. If you're writing this stuff, you don't have a team of visual effects people to make the spectacle there. All you have are words and writing down, and then a white beam rose phallically into the sky is just not gonna do it.
Well, I mean, you could try. I do remember going back to reading not so great books. R.A. Salvatore, all his D&D books. Oh my God, I just would, my eyes would glaze over after a while, because he'd write these super elaborate fight scenes where he's trying to, like you said, he's trying to sort of give you a movie, and it's pages of it, and it's like, oh my God, really, dude? Come on, man.
Right. But when you learn to write fight scenes from movies, what you end up doing is it feels like you're describing a fight scene that you watched and not something that you lived, and it's not that interesting. It doesn't get you in there inside the person who's doing the fighting, so it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like there are any stakes. It's just kind of dull to me. Like, let me tell you about this movie I watched. Like, okay, cool, thanks, sounds great.
Well, I would also say that a lot of the time I feel like even those fight sort of sequences in fiction of that type also do the same thing, which is, weirdly, there's no pain, there's no blood, there's no sort of, there's nothing that is not audiovisual. And part of that is obviously, when people say that utterly tedious and ridiculous, write what you know. No, you don't. You don't want to get into 100 fights to find out what that feels like. But obviously you need to convey that in a way that feels real, like more real than just watching, two guys in suits head punch each other. That's not interesting.
So when you're writing that like that, you're trying to rely on audiovisual spectacle, and you're just gonna fail because you don't have that to rely on. You're trying to lean on a strength that the medium doesn't have. And while you're doing that, you're neglecting the strength that the medium does have, because it's a great strength, perhaps the greatest strength that written fiction has, is this interiority, is that it can deal with the invisible, with the silent, and with the internal in a way that film can't, in a way that video games generally can't. you're ignoring the one great strength that books and written fiction, that stories have. And that's a real shame. It's an absolute waste to have this great thing and not use it.
This is something that I struggle with even today. I feel like there is a tendency to shy away from emotionality, from interiority in a lot of works because, that appeals broadly just the way that, these blockbuster movies appeal broadly. And you need emotion in your writing. You need something extra because, to paraphrase Aqua Teen Hunger Force, movies deliver it twice as fast. So honestly, it's easier to sit down and watch some dumb movie than to read, because there is a certain level of buy-in and what that gives you. Like the reading,
like you can play on your phone with a movie. You can't really do that with a book. You got to just look at the book. You can't goof off on your phone.
Right. I mean, you can. You are not going to enjoy reading,
right?
Because you can't have that divided, sort of like that weird divided attention, like you're hinting at. There is a level of the reader needs to be invited in and meet the prose halfway at the very least, and the other half is the writer needs to engage with emotions and, like you said, the strengths that a book has, hit on those heartstrings. Why is this fight important? Because that's the other thing. It's
right.
If there's no emotionality behind it, well, then why are they fighting? What's the point?
Right. And a movie can kind of start with a fight scene because you can visually encode sort of, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy, here's the underdog. You can sort of use composition and costume design and color to encode that, so that even without explicitly saying what's happening, the audience is going to immediately pick up, like, oh, these are the rebels and this is the empire. These are the good guys and that's the bad guy. That guy's bad because his costume's real scary. In a book, you don't really have that so much, and you need to give them that. You don't have that ability to encode information visually, and you need to give it some other way. But if you're so used to thinking in movie terms, you're going to miss out on giving that to us.
Right. And also, like, it's sort of weird because I was thinking about this morning that even in more modern writing, it's considered passé to sort of go into these long, maybe paragraph-long descriptions of the character, usually the main character and maybe some important ones. But, it's sort of weird how that's become passé, and we just decided to sort of go towards, this character, some basic sketching out of the character to distinguish them. But most of what happens is a lot of action, like what they do. Their actions are what sort of set them apart. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a weird observation I've had recently.
I think it's, again, taking the show don't tell thing too far, where it's like, oh, only show, never tell, and using the word show or the word tell in a very, very narrow, very specific way.
Yeah.
Kind of over-applying it. It's a bit of advice that's good for beginning writers, because beginning writers tell everything and show nothing a lot of the time. But people take it way too fucking far and never tell and end up showing in these very superficial or disinteresting ways. And sometimes I think it is okay or more efficient or more effective to just fucking tell me. Just fucking tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of that. I think it's a Picasso quote where he says, "I had to learn 20 years of painting to learn how to paint like a toddler," or something. I'm murdering that quote, but it's sort of interesting to see how you can get away with telling if you're if you know what you're doing. It's a great tool. Like, I was revisiting Those Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, and there is so much. I think most of that story, if not all of it, is all telling.
Pretty much.
It is complete exposition.
And it's great.
It's a fantastic story. I mean, it is really gut-wrenching.
Yeah, what if you tried to write it cinematic? Be like, the boy awoke in his cell.
Right.
He sighed. His stomach growled.
Right, because what she wants to do is she wants to show you the layers. So she does start. It's weird because it does sort of start cinematically with the parade and so on and so forth, and how the horses are champing proudly at their bits as they blah blah blah, and slowly it sort of peels away the layers of this great city called Omelas until you get to the rotten core of it. And that's where she just gives you a fucking gut punch, because that is a horrible, horrible condition for the utopia that everything else is.
Right.
And it's I would say it's all told. I mean, it works fantastically. But again,
and it's elegant prose too, so that's a big part of why it works. Like, you can get away with telling if you tell in a way that's really beautiful. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's Le Guin, come on now.
Yeah, she's great. She knows what she's fucking doing. You're going to tell Ursula Le Guin, no, you're doing it wrong, make it more cinematic. She will punch you in the balls.
She'll come back from the dead just to do that.
How dare you? All right. So there are a lot of symptoms to this style of writing, to this attempt to write cinematically in this very superficial way. One, I think, is delivering exposition solely through dialogue. Like, that is a thing you kind of have to do in movies, unless you do the opening crawl, which a lot of people don't really do anymore. It's considered sort of out of vogue for the most part, but delivering exposition solely through two characters talking to each other, especially when it's two characters explaining something that they already know to each other. You don't have to do that in a fucking book, but I see it all the time.
Well, as you know, Bob, the reader may not know these things, but we need to explain it in a way, even though we would both know exactly what the dinglehopper is.
I guess it's an attempt to show, not tell, but it is just... It's still telling. It's just having a character tell instead of the narrator. Like, you haven't fixed the problem at all. You just gave it to somebody else.
Right. And I mean, and again, this goes back to what tools you're using. And obviously this is a bit of a ham-handed one, I find. I sort of roll my eyes at it, unless it's like really well done in a way that would just something else is distracting me and it just rolls over me. But generally speaking, it's a super cliche to have like the exposition via dialogue, and I also see that in movies. It's or in TV shows as well. It's like,
oh yeah,
God, why are you guys talking about this? Didn't you just see that? Didn't you just do that?
Right. For those of you who got up to pee during the last scene, let's have another character give it a recap, because you were in the bathroom and you didn't hit pause for some reason. You were getting a snack. You were on your phone, so we're going to explain it again.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's just simply a limitation of the medium and the understanding.
Right. I mean, sometimes you can't really avoid it. Sometimes you just got to be like, oh, okay, let's just shove it in there. Let's just put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Kim Stanley Robinson approach that's like, fuck it. It's going to be exposition anyway. I try it. So here's the exposition, guys. Choke it down before you get to the next part. But I mean, some of it can be more like that type of exposition. I think I mentioned it sometime before that, like, I remember I had to, like, I felt like I needed to read the entire different whales chapter in Moby Dick. And when I realized, you know what, buddy? You can just flip past it. The next chapter has nothing to do with this one. Moby Dick is great for that. A lot of the chapters are just sort of like almost vignettes that build on the atmosphere. And again, this is exposition that builds on the atmosphere, but you don't need to know about the 800 whales that everyone knows that are actually fish or whatever. You can just continue and finish the amazingly great adventure that ends ends with Ishmael on a coffin, floating out in the South Sea.
Let's see. Another symptom of this I notice is something I've started calling bad blocking. And it's writing character actions, especially in conversation, like bad actors or badly directed actors. Now, to those of you who are unfamiliar with acting or theater terms, what blocking means is sort of how you plan characters or actors' movements. Because a script doesn't have a lot of stage direction. It's not really supposed to have that much direction. That's for the actors and the director to figure out. Scripts tend to just be very dialogue heavy. But you obviously can't have two characters standing motionless, talking. It looks really weird. So you've got to like plan, okay, when you say this line, you go center stage. And when you say that line, you walk across the stage and gaze out the window. And then you pick up the wine glass. Figuring all that stuff out, that's called blocking. And it's really hard to do it well. If you're an inexperienced actor and an inexperienced director, you end up doing these big sweeping gestures that look super hammy and are really cliched. And I find that's what a lot of writers do when they try to do this. Like, how many times have we read kind of a pulpy novel where someone drums their finger upon the table impatiently, or she bit her lip, or he swirled the wine in his goblet as he spoke, or her lip quivered, or he paced madly about the room, or she smoothed her skirt nervously, or he thrust his fists into the air and shouted, "You are tearing me apart, Lisa." These are like these big hammy gestures that are basically bad acting, bad direction, and bad blocking, because most writers aren't great actors and aren't great directors, and we're trying to do something that we see in movies, but we're not good at it. And it ends up looking really, really goofy. And another part of this is sort of bad acting, where we take the show don't tell thing too far, and we end up showing a character's emotional state with really cliched physical actions. Like he balled his fists as his face turned crimson with rage, or her eyes welled up with tears, or her lip quivered, she bit her lip, she bit her quivering lip, her lip quivered so she bit it. Girls in books are always biting their lips, and their lips are always quivering. I don't know, I don't bite my lips as much as girls do in books. It's very odd. But every time I see one of those, I roll my eyes because it's so corny, and I picture an actor doing it. And it's a bad actor. It's fucking Tommy Wiseau shit. It's terrible.
I'm just imagining, like, because a lot of this is also to avoid like the said bookisms. I feel like it's like a real sort of it's something that you don't need to do. He said, she said, that type of thing. He growled as he pounded his fist on the desk. It's
she
like
hissed.
I mean, you only need one or the other of those. You really don't need to have him pounding on the desk. But I think it's to your point. I think it's trying to not leave space for the reader to interpret or sort of insert what they would want to imagine there. And in a sense, I think there is this weird control that the writer is trying to exert, rather than let the reader just let the story engage them. They want to force the reader to see things in the way that the movie in their head says it should be.
Right. And you're not making a movie, and it's almost better to think of it as like, look, your reader is your director, and you got to give them space.
Yeah, it's amazing to read like a script or a play and see how little.
It's so bare bones.
Yeah, there's like interior, this, maybe 3 or 4 different settings or whatever, and interior, exterior, that's about it.
Yeah.
Unless there's some specific.
Here's where the walls go.
Yeah, unless there's some specific thing that they want to, like he, smiling, whatever. But even then, I feel like that would probably be crossed out.
Yeah, even then a director's going to be like, fuck you. This is my job. You sit down, screenwriter. I'm
going to make that motherfucker frown now that you told me to
fuck
do
you.
He's smiling. But yeah, I just think it's a way to avoid, like there's several things, and they're not all the same thing. But yeah, I think it's a way to avoid like the dialogue tags, because somehow that looks weird, and truth be told, no one pays attention to dialogue tags.
Nope.
Like the he said, she said, they said, whatever, whomever said, it just fades into the background because you just want that signifier. As a reader, I just need a light touch to remind me, oh, this is what this person said. And if it's a long dialogue thing, you do need to have something there to just let me know who's doing the talking back and forth. That's about it.
Right. I'm very much of the school of thought that dialogue tags should be as close to invisible as possible. Whenever a dialogue tag brings attention to itself, I kind of roll my eyes. Whenever a character growls I just think it's silly. I just picture someone literally going, grrr.
I mean, unless you're writing a werewolf, I think it's then it's fine. You know, he's in mid werewolfing, and he's like, grrr. You know, it's like, okay, that's fine. It fits.
It's just Goose or sighing. She sighed, and not really. I mean, imagine saying a whole line of dialogue.
I mean, the thing here is that
it's so melodramatic.
I'm also thinking, like, I'm just imagining, like, the thing here is that if you're exerting that much control as a writer on what the movie the reader wants to see in their head, be prepared for some very jerky, weird movements. Like, if she sighs all the time, I'm just imagining, like, some very melodramatic teenager that's just like, do I have to? Yeah.
Some Victorian fainting damsel diagnosed with feminine hysteria so that she can get lots of opium on her fainting couch.
Yeah.
I have the vapors. Bring the smelling salts.
He drummed his fists as he growled and pounded the desk with his other fist, and then you're like, wait, how much action is going on in this? Like, he's just sitting at a desk.
Her lip quivered. She bit her lip. Her lip just kept quivering. She had some kind of fucked up muscle spasm in her lip. She should probably get it checked out. There could be something neurologically going on. I don't know what's going on.
I mean, unless it's a Cronenberg film. Unless it's a Cronenberg film and she bit her lip off and it's still quivering, trying to say something.
It crawled across the floor and had like little lip babies.
Yeah, just sprout some eyes, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, the thing here is that understand, like, if you're approaching this from a writing standpoint, you need to understand that I feel like you need to understand that there needs to be space for that reader and for that reader to sort of meet the text halfway. That means that you probably don't need so much direction from the page. Just let them sort of figure it out. You can give context clues and all sorts of other stuff rather than that weird physical dialogue tags. I don't know about you, but sometimes I will, to denote some sort of emotion or something like that. You do have to establish it, but you can have the character looking at something else that seems important, you know, that type of thing. But you don't necessarily have to have like an action paired to dialogue.
No. And when it comes to showing emotion, I find it much better to try and make the reader feel that emotion rather than just telling the reader, and then she was sad, or then she started crying. If you tell me that someone cries, it's never going to make me cry. But if you kind of lead me through the thought process or the emotional journey that's making this character cry, then I'm totally with you.
Right.
You got me. You're going to make it happen.
I also wonder how much of this, I don't know how recent a lot of this is. I got here late, you know, but I do have to wonder, like, to be honest with you, like, is there a feedback from what types of movies people watch nowadays?
Right.
That aren't they're very sort of surface level, very sort of flat. You know, they're almost like, I mean, the MCU are just basically TV shows that are just 2-hour TV shows that are strung along. You know, and given that the fact that there's not a lot of sort of underneath the surface metaphor or, you know, like very complicated stuff going on.
No.
How does that then bounce back and affect someone who is trying to write like the movies that they watch?
Right. Then there's another feedback loop in here in terms of, I mean, there's not a ton of money to be made selling books for the most part. Very few authors get rich just by selling books, and a lot of the good money is made in selling the movie rights or the made-for-streaming TV series rights to your book.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of people are kind of writing stuff that will be more easily adapted for the screen, so there's not a lot of that internal stuff. It's all very surface because that's going to be very easy to adapt with very few changes. So that kind of feeds into that feedback loop too. So the kind of shallow surface level stuff gets adapted easier, and that's what you see, and those are the books you hear about, so those are the books you read and you write like that. And obviously you want to make money, so there's a financial incentive to write in this really superficial, bland way too. And that's a real fucking bummer.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that it also affects like that. And I don't think this is movies necessarily. It's just simply sort of capitalism writ large.
Yep.
Is the fact that a lot of stuff that comes out is it might have certain heavy themes, but it doesn't feel adult.
No, it's like you're dealing with war in the way you'd explain it to a 10-year-old.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like I think a lot of it also boils down to what Kurt on your previous media criticism episode said, that there's a lot of stuff out there that I feel that doesn't end with a question mark, but with a period.
Right.
And I mean, it's not exactly the same thing. It's not a one for one, but a lot of it seems to be very much broad appeal. I feel like a lot of sort of complex or maybe darker emotions don't get
No.
a lot of time, mainly because that would bring people down, and it affects the user experience. Now, if ever I wanted to say have a cursed phrase come out of my mouth like that, I was not expecting it to happen today. I am not thinking of readers as a user experience.
Right. So there's a lot of reasons why this is kind of happening. Part of it is just the ubiquity of film and kind of shallow film and maybe even video games as a medium too. I'm not knocking video games, but a book shouldn't be written in the same way a video game is written. It just shouldn't. And a lot of it is just, here's what the market tends to promote. Here's what the market likes. Because very often, good books don't make very good movies. And when a good novel is adapted effectively, there are massive, massive changes so much of the time. Like The Shining, the adaptation is so different from the book. Children of Men, Blade Runner is a wildly different movie than what the book was. It's barely related to the book, just because there's a lot of stuff in the book that couldn't work visually, like Mercerism. How the fuck would you... I don't know how you would do Mercerism in a movie. Or The Princess Bride, or American Psycho. They made a lot of really big changes in order to make these work as movies.
Yeah. Did you ever hear the... I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard it told that I think probably one of the things that peeved Stephen King about Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining was that he only ever received one phone call from Kubrick and about the adaptation. And I think that one of the lines that stuck with King was that Kubrick said, well, thinking that there are ghosts and actual hauntings seems rather optimistic, wouldn't you think? And I just find that so hilarious, because it's like, oh shit. Well, and Blade Runner I don't think they even really touch upon how fucking devastated the world is from like basically nuclear war. They only ever hint at the synthetic animals,
right,
in that first scene, and that's it. Whereas in the book,
right, the guy owns a fake sheep or something. Everyone owns a fake pet. They hint at it, and is that snake real, or is that owl real? And because there's a replicant owl, but they don't really talk about it that much.
Yeah. And and also you just reminded me of like my movie experience with American Psycho. I remember the first time I saw it, I walked out of the theater pissed because it is in fact an ending that leaves a question mark at the end of it, and I wasn't really...
They pull the rug out from under you. You're like, what the fuck?
Well, I mean, I was like, fuck this. It didn't happen? What are you talking about? Like, well, this is just ridiculous. And then I realized, like, I rewatched it like maybe a year or two later and realized like, this is genius, because it didn't really matter. He's white and he's super rich. He could have just killed 20 people, and it didn't really... No one was ever going to come after him.
Right.
Or he's just so bonkers insane that it also more disturbing, perhaps.
Right. Or this is symbolic in a way. I mean, of what he's doing to the world. the way that he's running the world is doing some very, very real violence. It's just he's a couple of steps removed from it, so he doesn't really see the blood personally.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what we mean by the invisible or the internal. We've talked a lot about how books can give you the invisible, but what does that mean? What's that? What do we mean by giving people the invisible and the internal?
I would probably say that if I were to make a definition of it, is the fact that you want to replicate the everyday human condition of walking through your life in the real world, in your memories, and in vague little dreams and snippets of imagination that happen every day. Like every second of every day, you are engaging on at least 2 or 3 different levels of like reality. There's, your internal reality, your own thoughts, your hopes and dreams, your fears, why exactly you feel something like, you feel despondent or whatever. Oh, wait, this is the day, 5 years ago that something happened. And I feel like you don't get that in movies. Right. Or at least it's difficult to portray without having like a weird stutter of like flashback and flash forward scenes as you're like following a character through their just everyday life, which would just be off-putting. You just what's going on, but you can get away with that in a story. You can have little asides like that.
Right. I guess it's the difference between having your memory versus watching an old like home movie. It's not the same experience. It's a radically different experience, and it feels different. Right.
Or, interesting exercise. Have someone remember something vastly different than how it is portrayed on an actual home movie. Yeah, right. That's how you introduce an unreliable narrator.
Yeah. I guess it might be better to just give examples of what we're talking about. One really good example might be Kafka's The Metamorphosis. So much of that story is under the surface. It's what's going on in Gregor's head after he wakes up and he finds out he's a big bug. It's not, he did this and then he did that, but he's thinking like, oh shit, I gotta get to work. I'm on my back. I don't know how to flip over. My legs are real spindly. Let me see if I can just... And we spend so much time in poor Gregor's head as he's working out just how to flip over onto his stomach so he can walk around. Mm-hmm. And it's so internal.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of it is also the fact that it hints at how he's already been sort of cast as sort of like an alien creature by his own family, but they also depend on him. So, like the metaphor and his internal thoughts sort of combine to let you know, he has sort of internalized the fact that he is a bug to his family, but they also depend on him. And it's just such a weird, awesome like turn to realize that it's a horribly depressing story, but it's a good one to read to get that sense of interiority, because he is sort of trapped in a new body that does not do what it used to. Right. Like he can't even turn over. He's just these little like spindly little bug feet. He doesn't know what bugs eat. It's terrible. Like a more contemporary movie of that would be like, you're probably, Mo, I'm a bug. I'm sure you're wondering how I got here.
Record scratch.
Just like a very cheerful, like Quantum Leap.
It's a Pixar movie.
Oh boy.
He finds out he's a bug. Uh-oh. Get some pop songs in there. He learns a valuable lesson about friendship and accepting yourself.
Well, if you're gonna be a bug, be all about the bug.
Another really good example is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So much of that novella is just in the governess's head, to the point where we really don't know what's real and what is not. And a lot of film adaptations of that story fall flat, because when you're representing it visually, you're deciding sort of what's real and what's not. Like, okay, we're seeing this on screen, so obviously the apparition's real. Right. It kind of does that to us, and that's why there aren't very many good adaptations to it, or adaptations of it end up having to change it massively to be anything good. Like The Others. The Others is very clearly inspired by it, but it kind of takes a very different route, and it's just got the same atmosphere, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, like, looking at you, The Haunting of Bly Manor, which, if you've never read Turn of the Screw, is fine. It's not horrible, but it's just very, I felt a little ham-handed. In parts, it's ham-handed, and in parts, it's weirdly wants to, like, oh, this is a ghost story, but the ghosts are all trauma. And it's like, no, can we just have ghosts? Let's just have ghosts.
I mean, it already did do that in the book, but in a much more subtle way. And in a way that in a way, to me, having that kind of subtlety where it's not this very clearly straightforward, this clearly represents that, and that clearly represents that. To me, that gets at what trauma does to a person in a way that's so much more truthful.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that basic one-to-one, almost sort of logical, she was bitten by a dog, so dogs upset her. A lot of the times it'll be like, she was bitten by a dog, so she doesn't trust men. Like, what? Like, it kind of ends in this weird indirect way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how the novello does it, and versus these adaptations that are too tidy, they're too clean and easy.
Yeah, I feel like the other adaptation, the book that got adapted to that Haunting of series, The Haunting of Hill House, like, the book is very, like, exactly what's happening in Eleanor's head, like, all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Like, she intrudes upon the narrative, which is great because it's all about her, like, and what she recognizes in Hill House and what Hill House recognizes in her. And if you didn't have that interiority, it'd be like just a weird, disjointed story about some weird, like, recluse woman who just never fit in. And you're like, there's reasons for that.
Yeah.
What about her story?
Yeah. And the adaptation couldn't give us that, so it just gave us, like, oh, family.
Well, and also
shitty fan fiction.
The weird time traveling ghost thing, which it can work, but generally speaking, you have to sort of do something to pull it off, I feel.
Yeah. Ugh. But anyway, cosmic horror, I think, is another great example as a genre of writing the invisible. So much of cosmic horror is about how if you look at this thing, it will drive you insane. Which, again, is why it's so poorly handled in movies, because movies are visual. And I don't think there's a special effects crew that can literally drive us insane with just, look how scary this monster is. So whenever you try to visually represent Cthulhu, you just go, oh, it's just a big squid, okay. Like, that's not scary.
Yeah.
I don't feel crazy, it's just a squid man, whatever.
I mean, I think it's been flattened from what Lovecraft himself was trying to convey, which is he never was concrete. So it's sort of like a squid head and sort of like a dragon's wings and sort of maybe like this. And it's like, which is supposed to be like all incongruous parts, which is why it doesn't sort of fit together and why it sort of doesn't follow the normal rules of our reality as we understand it. But yeah, to your point, I feel like movies have to work really hard for them to get to that just vibing part of, like, the aesthetic and the atmosphere that a good horror book or story is able to achieve rather well and easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you don't take advantage of the invisible, what you end up is you miss out on this. You miss out on what could be your greatest strength, and it's an absolute waste. If you're not going to engage with the invisible in your story, then maybe don't write a story. Maybe write a script or an audio drama or make a video game or something, but don't waste your time and the reader's time making a story that is not at its heart a story that wants to be a movie. Don't do it.
Yeah.
All right. So another way that the written word differs from movies, from visual media, is the way it handles time. Films are generally linear, maybe with a couple of flashbacks thrown in. I know Memento goes backwards, but that's kind of the one different thing, and it's a bit of a gimmick. But movies are a lot more linear than books are, and films run at their own predetermined speed. You hit play and they go, and that's how they're meant to be watched. But a book goes at the pace of the reader and not the director's, and since it's all on the page, you can flip back and forth, and like no one's going to stop you. There's no book cop that's going to stop you from doing that. So just fundamentally, your audience is going to engage with it in a different way temporally, and you might want to try and take advantage of that.
Right. I mean, there is, for you to be immersed in reading generally means that something won't necessarily make you sort of put the book down or the story down or whatever until you're done. But in general, you can completely have stuff that's seeded in 15 chapters back and suddenly come to the fore now, and it'll still be there for the reader to flip back and goes, oh, wait a minute, they said this. But of course, you could also just include a remembrance of that little seeded establishment right before you then reveal whatever it is, right? Whatever the plot turn is. But also, going back to the sort of immersed in memory and in internal thoughts idea, you can also have stuff in the past come up in the present.
Right.
He felt let down and suddenly remembered how he was always picked last for baseball teams, that type of thing. And that's just a simple line you can just put in there. But you're inferring like a deeper sort of hurt that character has.
And then when she was introduced to her boss, she realized it was the girl who was a bitch to her in high school. Like,
oh no!
Now we got that time. Now it's all together. And I guess you would handle that with a flashback in a movie, but you kind of don't have to do that in a book. Just that one line, and there it is. In written fiction, you can weave together a lot of different times, a lot of these different threads of time in one section of the book. What's happening now, what recently happened, the characters' shared history of the space where the action is, maybe some hint at the future. And I feel like film really only handles one time at once. We're in this scene, this is what's happening now. Now it's a flashback, here's what happened before, but that's it. It can only really handle one time period at a time, and books can kind of weave them together and try and take advantage of that.
Yeah.
It's really, really rich. You have all these things you can work with, and it's a shame not to use these things that are available to you.
Yeah, I mean, like, just think of, I just pulled it up because it's such a great line, the English translation to 100 Years of Solitude, where it does that immediately. It lets you know. It says, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Coronel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. What time period is this story going to start in? Because you start off with a memory with a future, a flash forward, and him having a memory in that flash forward. Could you do that in a movie?
Oh, gosh. It would be so hard, and it wouldn't hit right. It wouldn't hit the same way.
Yeah. I mean, the cheesy way would be to have him, like
a voiceover,
or pan in on his eye, and it's like the gleam of his eye, and then suddenly the scene of him discovering ice. I don't think it's very hammy, but it would work. I don't think it would be a good thing.
It wouldn't hit as well.
I think it's just one of those things that you need to read it because you can sort of see how past, present, and future just sort of folded together just in a perfect little sentence.
Yeah. And another aspect of time, too, is that books are longer, usually. So you have more room to sprawl out and be complex and big. Like, it takes around maybe 8 hours to read a novel. So you get more room to play, more stuff, more depth. And that's a reason why so many adaptations of great novels kind of feel like a book report. Like a section of a novel that might have taken up an hour ends up taking 3 minutes in the movie, and it just doesn't have that weight. And it's also a part of why movies based on short stories tend to be a lot better. Like The Maltese Falcon was a short story. Brokeback Mountain was a short story.
Arrival.
Arrival was a short story. And it gives you a basic template and then leaves the director enough room to sort of put their own ideas in there. Whereas a book, you have so much in there, and if you're going to adapt it to something that's 2 or even 3 hours, you just gotta cut. You just have to diminish it instead of making something greater.
Right. I mean, and that is, I mean, to be fair, that is a fantastic talent if you can pull it off and pull it off well. Knowing where you need certain things that are from a book in adaptation of it is very important. But the thing here is that they have to be 2 separate things.
Yeah.
And I feel like, to your point, the short stories, and I feel like there's a movement towards lots of movies recently, at least maybe I'm just noticing them more often, are based on short stories. And I feel that they're stronger for it. Mainly because short story is the playground a lot of the times for readers, because there's not a huge financial constraint. Like the idea that you could make a lot of money is not part of the short fiction part of things.
No.
Folks, you can't. The days of living off of your short fiction are long past, if they ever existed.
Not happening.
But because you don't have that pressure, I feel like an author can be more experimental, can do more things, can leave things ambiguous or open-ended, which then fits a sort of a filmmaking milieu much better than, say, a novel.
Right.
Where the novel has to sort of have its own weaving together of all the different themes and then come to a climax and then end, or whatever your structure may be.
Oh yeah, another aspect of a novel I should have mentioned too is, remember, a movie is you're supposed to sit down for 2 hours and watch it and then stop. Ideally, that's how you do it. A book, you are meant to put that down every so often, unless you expect your readers to be crazy and sit there for 8 fucking hours. You expect them to put it down.
Yeah.
So you're letting them engage with it in a different way, and maybe you want to write it as a series of vignettes like Moby Dick is. Or maybe you, knowing that readers will skim parts of it, maybe you want to put in sections that they're going to skim. Like House of Leaves, there are these whole sections where I kind of think it's just nonsense and you're meant to sort of skim over it. Or in the original American Psycho, after every murder, Patrick Bateman gives a really long, extended, detailed product review. Like there's that scene where he's talking about the new Huey Lewis and the News album while he's killing a person. In the book, what it does is he kills a person and then would talk about Huey Lewis and the News on and on and on. And it's really goes on because it's meant to be relentless. It's meant to be not mind-numbing. And I'm imagining that the readers are meant to kind of skim it just to get the point of like, oh my God, shut up, dude.
Right.
So you can kind of deliberately frustrate and bore people because they can skim it. In a movie, you kind of can't, because people will just like leave or stop and go watch something else.
I also thought that it was the point was also to sort of hammer home the idea that Patrick Bateman as a persona is a bit of a product himself.
Right.
So now I'm just thinking of him leaving Yelp reviews for different shitty restaurants that he thought were better.
Oh God.
Could you imagine? But anyway, I think it's just one of these things that it's put in there to just also, if you weren't sure, given all his gross killing and cannibalism and shit like that, if you weren't put off by that, this should let you know that he's utterly repugnant and completely empty. Like he is, as he's just, there's nothing there, as he said.
Yeah. So let's skip from time over to structure. Another thing that books have, I think, that movies don't, is you get a little bit more freedom to experiment with structure. It's not that films can't be experimental, it's just that movies are so much more expensive, so studios really don't want to take big risks. You don't want to put millions and millions and millions of dollars into something that's deliberately confusing, because you're going to lose the audience a lot. So books can kind of play with structure in a way that films can't. I'm thinking of House of Leaves. the way it plays with its structure is, I mean, it plays with, there are pages that are like backwards or upside down. There are pages where the words are arranged in a way, in like a specific shape to give you a certain feeling. There's also this funny dual narrative structure where on the one hand you're reading this description of a series of videotapes, and underneath it in these footnotes you have this framing device of this tattoo artist who's absolutely losing his mind while he's reading this account of this description of these videotapes. Another example is Lincoln in the Bardo. Lincoln in the Bardo, it's the story of the death of President Lincoln's son and the effects it has on the ghostly inhabitants of a local cemetery. It's told as a series of quotations from various accounts. Some are historical accounts, some are like personal diaries, primary sources, secondary sources, and also individual quotations by the ghosts in this cemetery. And these depictions, these testimonies contradict each other. They're wildly different from each other, and it instead of one solid narrative structure, it's like you've assembled little pieces that don't always fit together of like 100 different narrators. And I don't know how you'd do a film that way.
I mean, that sounds like a complete quilt of different narration that then produces like an Uber narrative. I don't even know what to call that exactly.
Yeah, it's
I'm sure
very interesting the way it's done.
Interesting.
Let's see. There's The Naked Lunch, whose structure is deliberately confusing. William S. Burroughs believed that language was a type of mind virus, and in a lot of his work he tried to sort of tear it apart and destroy it to free himself from it. So I believe he wrote The Naked Lunch in a way that's linear, but he chopped it up and rearranged it in a way that was deliberately confounding, because he wanted to stress us out and confuse us and unmoor us. Cloud Atlas is another really fantastic example of an interesting structure. It consists of 6 stories that are folded into each other like a Russian doll. So you start at the beginning in, I think, the early 1800s, late 1700s, with a story about an explorer, and you get the first half of that story, and then it ends mid-sentence. And then suddenly we get a story, like a series of diary entries written in the 1930s in Vienna, and we get the first half of that, and then that ends. And then we get the first half of another story in, I think, the 1970s, and it's a political thriller, and then the first half of a farce in present day, and then the first half of a cyberpunk future story, and then you get the entirety of this distant future post-apocalyptic story, and you get the whole thing. And then when that ends, you start going back in time. So you get the second half of the cyberpunk story, and then the second half of the present-day farce, and then the second half of the 70s political thriller, and so on and so on and so on, until finally you get the second half of the very first story. And it's a very wonderful structure, and it's beautiful, and it works, and it's great. And in the film adaptation, they had to change that because an audience would never accept that. Maybe around the when you start getting into the third story, they'd be like, "Wait, what about the other two? This is bullshit. I'm done. I hate this." Right. They would never accept this.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would imagine that the general audience would probably not respond well to that, which also brought its own challenges and problems to the adaptation, because then you have Tom Hanks being sort of orientalized and Halle Berry being a white woman, and it's just like that was a problem apart from it, but I understood why, mainly because if you want to show that these are sort of maybe not exactly reincarnations, but definitely like the same people keep showing up, you're starting to point at a pattern that exists in the story, whereas in a novel you can get away with that because there's you're gonna I guess presume that a reader is going to come along with you for the ride because you're doing things the right way. You're engaging in narrative and so on and so forth in a way that is interesting.
Plus there's a sort of a meta text to it too. Like the first half of the story, it's the diary entries of this explorer, and then in the second one is the diary entries of a composer, and he finds the first half of that manuscript in the library of this guy he's working for.
Okay.
and like each next story kind of refers to the previous story, engaging, like then the one woman in the 1970s listens to the composition written by the guy from the 30s, and like so on and so forth, and it's sort of woven together. And oh, I found this copy of the manuscript, and oh, I read this book, and it works really, really well. And again, how are you going to do that in a movie?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I understood why they did it the way they did it in the movie, and it's the Wachowskis who can get away with like still having studios give them money for these things.
Yeah, for here, give me tons of money for this completely crazy idea. Like that's awesome that they can keep doing that, especially these days.
Yeah, you reminded me of this a series of 2 books by Catherine Valenti, who wrote The Orphan Tales. They're in The Orphan's Tales in the Night Garden and in the Lands of Coin and Spice, and it's essentially like a Scheherazade. Am I saying that right?
I have no idea.
I'm not entirely sure. Arabian Nights. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Structure where each chapter ends introducing the character that's going to be in the next chapter, and all of these are sort of interwoven, sort of in a concentric circles, and then in the second book you get all the way back out from the deepest part of the story back out to the original orphan who's telling the story, and it's really interesting to see someone pull it off.
Yeah,
I haven't revisited it, but I mean, she got 2 books that are structured that way published, so I'm going to say that Catherine Valenti, kudos to you for pulling it off.
Yeah, she could do it. That is a really big undertaking. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Don't be afraid to use that, in other words. Don't be afraid to do that, because again, this is a unique strength of the medium, and use that fucking strength if you can.
Oh, yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I keep going back to, that these are all just great tools. Just don't leave them lying in the dust because you want to just do an audiovisual medium of like, I want the movie in my head to be on the page. It's like, you can use other tools. You do have to think about them, though, and which ones you want to take out of the toolbox to really engage with writing and the full sort of spectrum of what writing can do. You know, engage the senses, engage the mind, engage memory and thought and emotion in a way that movies can only sort of imitate.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's turn to one of the biggest things, I think, which is voice. One of the most important and wonderful aspects of a book or a short story is the writer's voice, which is something you can't code into a film. And that's why so many film adaptations of great novels have a narrator talking through the whole thing, because that voice is what readers fell in love with. I mean, even a really good adaptation like American Psycho will do that. It had Patrick Bateman's constant voiceover the entire time, because the story doesn't work without that.
Yeah. I mean, also, don't forget The Princess Bride, which has, the movie itself has this great framing to allow that to happen. Because, you know, you get Fred Savage and Peter Falk reading the Princess Bride book. And then in certain parts, it's like, hold on, stop. Is this about kissing? And then, you jump back out of the story because they're going to have like an offline discussion about, and it mimics it. That's the weird thing. Like, I think Golding, because he wrote both the book and the movie, understood that you can completely mess with time in a movie about a book, because that's how you deal with books.
Right. And that's how storytelling is.
Yeah, you stop momentarily to argue about canon. You can do that. You can do that in a book. You cannot do that in a movie, at least not in the movie theater, because people are going to shush you. Because again, the movie's moving at its own pace. You know, by the time you can't pause it to talk shit about the movie and how this didn't fit in.
Right. But developing your voice as a writer is such a big part of becoming a good writer. And if you don't use that at all, then why are you even writing? I mean, part of the reason why we love certain writers is they have these unique, interesting voices. And part of the reason why we fall in love with a book is this wonderful voice. The book itself almost becomes like a character you're talking to, that you develop a relationship with. Mm-hmm. And it's an absolute travesty to neglect this. Like, think of some of I'm thinking of some writers that I love, or books that I love. To Kill a Mockingbird had this really beautiful voice. Or Kurt Vonnegut's bleak, absurdist humor, where he keeps repeating these "so it goes" phrases over and over again. Or you got Cormac McCarthy's style. You have Hemingway's masculine prose. And this isn't just like the great highfalutin writers who have this. Even pulp writers or pop writers like Mickey Spillane or Helen Fielding of Bridget Jones's Diary have this unique voice to their work that makes the readers fall in love with them. And if you're trying to be pure cinema, you end up missing this voice. And it is a tragedy to deny yourself that, to deny your readers that.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because I always wonder, like, I don't know if you've ever done this exercise yourself. Have you ever asked yourself what your own voice is?
I have.
It's
I'm
infuriating
sure.
because it's infuriating because I don't know what my voice is, but other people read my stuff and say, "Oh, such a great voice." I'm like, "What are they talking about?" I'm the same person. And I think the only thing I can come up with as sort of like an exercise in driving yourself a little crazy is to assume that the voice a certain novel or story or whatever you're writing has is sort of like the weird persona you've adopted to write that. as if it weren't difficult enough.
Right. I mean, you're becoming the narrator,
right?
Not necessarily the writer. And there's a difference between who you are, the person sitting in the chair typing, versus who this narrator is.
Right. And maintaining a distance so that it doesn't sound like, if the story does not require it to sound like you talking in everyday life, you need to be aware of that. It's I don't know. We sit in rooms and write, listening to voices in our head. What can I say, folks?
I want to take an exemplary passage from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye that uses voice and structure and time in this incredibly elegant way. So I'm gonna read this bit. It was a long time before my sister and I admitted to ourselves that no green was going to spring from our seeds. Once we knew, our guilt was relieved only by fights and mutual accusations about who was to blame. For years I thought my sister was right. It was my fault. I had planted them too far down in the earth. It never occurred to either of us that the earth itself might have been unyielding. So let's look at this passage a little bit. It's this really fucking great passage from The Bluest Eye. Let's look a little bit about the stretch of time. We're going over a passage of years, right? From the moment of planting, and then sometime years later when they're coming to this conclusion, and the years they've spent arguing about it before somebody figures out what's going on. So we've got this stretch of years kind of compressed, but we zero in on a couple of moments, the arguments, the initial planting, and we keep returning to this initial moment of planting.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of bracketed by, I'm remembering when I first perceived that we admitted to ourselves that this is the problem.
Yeah. And that's invisible too. It never occurred to us. That's something invisible. You can't visually code that. It never occurred to us. You can't visually code something that did not happen.
Well, I mean, and also it's an idea. How do you film an idea?
Right. Aside from a character making a really corny eureka gesture.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like, and this is not even an idea, but a non-idea, an idea they didn't have.
Right. Exactly.
How the fuck do you visually code that? You can't. So this passage embodies so many of these amazing tools that you only get with the written word that you can't get with an audiovisual medium like film, all together in this really nice, tight little passage that's gorgeous and deep and evocative and just devastating. Like that last line, it never occurred to either of us that the earth itself might have been unyielding. Like, oh my God. And it's like, bam, there's the theme of your novel. There it is, right there.
Where does this, is this at the beginning of The Bluest Eye?
Yeah, it's near the beginning.
Okay, that makes sense. I wasn't sure if this was like the last line or the beginning. Either one would fit. But
yeah, this is around the beginning. And it really sets up the perspective of the novel, too, of like, we're tracing back to the beginning where things went wrong for this one character.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, and it's great. It's sort of like that 100 Years of Solitude quote as well, where it's sort of like there's time upon time folded upon itself, sort of right there for you to see.
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, how do you show something that's like an idea that no one had? Not in a movie.
Yeah, the only way you could do this in a movie is here's the voiceover.
Yeah.
A montage with a voiceover, just clumsy.
It would be very corny, but to quote Brian Cox in Adaptation, where he's portraying McGee, the screenwriter, and he's like, and God help you if you use voiceover. But the funny thing about the movie is that the last half, he says, God help you if you use voiceover, but they'll forgive you if you end well. And the last bit of the movie is just complete voiceover, and it's a bang up ending, and it's so fucking hilariously apt and accurate that I'm sitting there just in awe of the fact that I'm aware that that this is being done to me, but also it works.
So let's talk a little bit about why we need to write stories that are happy to just be stories and not desperately trying to be movies, and also how we can do this. Why is it so important to write books that are happy being books and not books that desperately want to be movies?
I think it's a question of all of the tools that we have mentioned up until this point. You want to make sure that you have the option to use them and not pare away any of those tools in the effort of trying to fit a movie into a book into a movie-shaped whole. Mainly because movies are insane, like they're very, very large risks financially. And that's why you have formulaic plots. You have like that save the cat formula that a lot of movies follow regarding how to portray characters and how a story is structured and so on and so forth. And they have it down to the minute sometimes what exactly is supposed to happen in a movie regarding its story structure. And books don't have to follow that structure. It's a different medium. You can do whatever you want. And I mean, there are risks in writing books. Right. Sure.
I mean,
but
it's a time investment for sure. But I mean, worst case scenario is you don't get officially published and maybe you self-publish.
Right.
But
well, and even then, I think that the issue is that because even on the market side of things, a publisher understands that a book is a book and may be willing to accept a book that has a strange structure to it or that has a less than stellar happy ending because you wrote a book. There is a risk from the publisher, of course, but it's not the same risk and they're not under the same pressures.
Right.
And like you said, even if you might end up trunking that novel, you might decide to write another one, or you might decide to punch it up and just put it online somewhere. If it's not for everyone's taste, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Right. I mean, you just have more freedom and it's a shame not to use it.
Yeah.
And I've also got a philosophy, which is if I want a movie experience, I will watch a movie. If I'm reading a book, I want it to be a book. If I'm going to invest the time in reading a book, I want something in my hands that is a book and that is happy being a book and that is proud to be a book, not something that wishes it was a movie. I'll just watch a fucking movie.
Right. I mean, everyone's heard the cliche, right? The book was better. Well, imagine that, but for all the books that didn't get made into movies.
Absolutely. And I understand why writers sometimes do that. I mean, we're competing against a lot more visual media now. I mean, in the 1800s, your options for entertainment were like read a book, vaudeville, or like chase a hoop with a stick. And like right now we got TV is like way better than it used to be. Visual effects and movies are really good and everything's available on streaming. And plus you got video games. So I understand this like, well, if you can't beat them, join them sort of, or we got to beat them at their own game. But we can't beat film at its own game.
Yeah.
Because the game is being a movie, and a movie is better at being a movie than a book is, because it's a movie, and a book is not a movie. And you're just destined to fail when you're trying to beat film at its own game. Just try and be a good fucking book, and then you'll beat the movie at the game of being a book, because a movie's not a book.
Right. Well, and not to mention, like, even the action of watching a movie is it's a much more passive thing. You allow the movie to stream into your eyes. A book, you actually have to choose it. So there's even more freedom, even in the act of reading. And I'm not trying to make it try to mystify it or anything like that. I'm just saying that you have to want to read a book. You have to want to watch a movie to watch it, but once you're watching it, you don't have to do anything else. Like you said, you can play on your phone for the rest of it if it's sort of boring and still say that you, quote, watched a movie. A book, you can't sort of half-ass it that way. You just can't. You need to really want. Yeah. You really want to. Yeah, you really have to want to finish it to really engage with it.
Like, I put a movie on and then argued with someone on Twitter for 2 hours. You can't really do that with a book.
Yeah. I would say that even audiobooks, to a certain extent, don't fulfill the exact same thing either. And
I guess in terms of time, the time is chosen for you by the narrator. I mean, I'm not knocking audiobooks. Maybe you don't have time to sit with a book in front of your face and you want to listen to an audiobook at the gym or while commuting or something. Well, at the gym that we're not allowed to go to right now. But you know what I mean. During normal times.
I mean, in the sense that, for me, the experience, let me put it that way, because then I don't want people thinking I'm being ableist. Audiobooks are totally valid as reading. I'm just saying that for me, I don't get the same experience a lot of the time with audiobooks than I do with just reading an actual book. So I feel like that is something that's important for you to keep in mind when you're writing, that you are able, if you're using all your tools to write, you are able to engage a reader so that they actually embody the story you're writing, and they're watching it happen in their head and they're helping you along.
And always ask yourself, why does this need to be a book and not a movie script? Why does this need to be a short story and not a little video game? If you don't have a real answer, you need to rethink your story.
Yeah.
Because maybe you don't really want to be a writer of fiction. Maybe you'd rather be a screenwriter, or maybe you want to be a comic writer. And that's cool. That's fine. But if you're going to write fiction, if you're going to write stories and books, then do that instead of sort of half-assing that while wishing you were something else. Because it comes through in your work.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that the issue here is that I do want to point out that there are a lot of writers that sort of write in those different channels. That will write fiction and will write for a game or perhaps for TV or what have you. Understand that each of those channels requires different things from your writing. Books are the ones that I feel allow you to use all the tools at your disposal.
Right.
And I don't feel like game writing or filmmaking are necessarily going to allow you to use all those tools, mainly because of the way that the medium is constructed.
Right. And also read more books and stories, particularly those with interesting structure or voice, and really look for literature written before the ubiquity of film and TV. They perceive the world in a very different way, I think, because people weren't completely obsessed with visual media yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's extremely worthwhile to read some of this old stuff that was written before everybody got used to looking at motion pictures. Because action sequences, just physical stuff is handled really, really differently. And you know that a lot of the time this is being written by people who experienced it, by people who lived it, and not by people who watched an actor pretend to do it.
That's true. But even the pacing is different. I feel.
Moby Dick, it's these little vignettes. It's this long, sprawling. I mean, it's a journey, and like any journey, it's really quiet for a lot of parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, he spends a lot of time, dare I say it, world building before the actual adventure happens. But yeah, that's exactly what that is. Like, he shows that weird seaside chapel and all these weird little vignettes, and they all come together because it sort of gives you a feeling for what this world felt like, which I feel is something that a film cannot really exactly get you to feel.
Yeah.
Because it's like, again, Ursula K. Le Guin saying, like, a theme is what I spent 200 pages in a book trying to explain.
Right.
And film can't get that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap it up before the gods intervene yet again and try and stop us from finishing this episode. Thanks for coming on the show. How can our listeners find you or support your work?
Well, they can find my website, alignofink.com. I am a co-host on the Podside Picnic podcast. That is Patreon/PodsidePicnic. Patreon.com/PodsidePicnic, where Pete and I talk at length about our genre educations or miseducations, as the case may be. And that's about it for right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me back for the second time ever.
For the definitely first time ever.
Yes,
we have
never.
not recorded this before. Nothing happened.
No.
Everything is fine. All right. And thank you, audience, for listening. That's all for this episode. If you like what you heard, head on over to patreon.com/writegood and sign up. Subscribers get early access to new episodes, bonus content, and an invitation to the Discord, where we watch movies and have group writing sessions. And be sure to listen to us next time. Until then, keep writing good.
KittySneezes.com in color.